Buckle up, Buttercups. I hope you have your organic, non-GMO popcorn. We have Mark Lerner with us today from Great Bear Enterprises, 40 plus years with astrology and numerology and tarot, and he connects it all together. As I've said many times in the past, if this is your first time watching and seeing Mark, his parents wanted him to be a doctor, so he said, okay, I want to be a doctor of the stars. I love that, man. Love that. Mark, it's great to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you for being a guest on Leak Project. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to get started sharing about a subject that has been in my life since I was a kid.
Right on.
About outer space, about what's going on in the cosmos, who built the pyramids, like all the things that you've been having so many different guests on, and of course, astrology, tarot, numerology, those are kind of three big things in my life, but love of astronomy, just metaphysics, spiritual things. And, I've been feeling fortunate to be on your show, different kinds of shows about different subjects for many years now. And you and I decided last time, let's take a look at the fact that a big movie is coming out from Steven Spielberg. We didn't say it exactly the last time, but fundamentally, that's where I'd like to go with this hour. Why are we having a disclosure day? That's the little title movie from Steven Spielberg. Like, what's his astrology? How he and George Lucas came out in a very significant year, as you know, in 1977, in the spring with Star Wars #1 and Close Encounters in the fall. It was a very special year. It had all those sevens. And I was in Scotland at this place that I lived at called Findhorn, a community, educational community. And I remember on 7/7/1977, with all those sevens, that we gathered in a place called the Hall, which was being built, a 5-sided building like the Pentagon. So I don't know how many, there are different unusual buildings that are being created around the earth, like different shapes, octagons, pentagon kind of things.
You just mentioned, sorry to interrupt, but you brought up the 5-sided pyramid, and there's a 5-sided pyramid on Mars in the city of Cydonia. It's called the Cydonia region. And that's like the Pentagon in DC. Interesting connection. And 77 is the same year that they launched the Viking orbiters.
Well, the two orbiters, which are the whole year, this is also when, for astrologers, Chiron, this little planet, was discovered, named after a centaur, the wise centaur Chiron from Greek mythology. So people want to study that. Astrologers have been including that. So if you're interested in getting, a report from my website, we'll look at that later, maybe toward the end. From Great Bear Enterprises, we have 20 different reports on astrology and numerology. If you don't want to take the leap into doing an actual phone consultation, sometimes people just need to start small, get a chart, get a report, read about yourself. That's what astrology is really all about. And numerology and tarot, all of these are oracles. They're languages, you know what I mean? They're, just to be really clear, because I differ with a lot of professional astrologers, and I have been a professional astrologer for over 40 years and learned from unbelievable teachers, and did a fantastic magazine called Welcome to Planet Earth. There's my updated picture of me. There's another one on my website. That's me at 20 years old, but if you find that, it's near the top where people can tune into things. At any rate, this is a great visual of some of the things on the website, and we'll probably go back there later. We did a tarot deck with my ex-wife years ago called Inner Child Cards, which has been translated into over a dozen languages. And so we co-created that back in the 1990s. And I also co-created with somebody else, Laura Phillips, and an artist, Baseball Tarot. So I'm the co-creator of 2 tarot decks. I've worked with tarot longer than astrology. It goes back to metaphysics, the Kabbalah, studying secret teachings of all ages and ancient cultures. So everything that you are providing for years now, from the Bear clan that we're part of, you very much so, from your name, literally, whereas mine came out of watching Close Encounters, really, in the fall of 1977. when the main star of that movie, they see these spaceships making the Great Bear, the constellation of the Big Dipper, and they start laughing. And this is toward the end, on desert, what do you call it, Devil's Tower, to remind people that's not giving away Close Encounters, but it is sort of getting us back to these two guys, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, who were really best friends. And that's sort of what I want to talk about today, about how we've missed the understanding of the magic of movies and of television and of how we grew up in the 40s and 50s before YouTube, before Leak Project, before Patreon, before all of these amazing opportunities for so many more people to see these things. But in the epoch I was born in the 1950s and 60s, everything was on television. And the thing that's interesting I was thinking about today to try and explain this, because I'm a creature of television, particularly in the 50s in New York City. What people don't understand is we didn't have just NBC, CBS, and what's the third? ABC, right? So in New York City, because it's like millions of people, right? We had a whole bunch of stations, okay? Most of the rest of the country had 3 stations, the 3 main, what we call the news channels now. And then eventually it was public broadcasting. But for instance, in New York City, because I'm a big baseball fan and sports fan, we had something called Channel 9, where the Brooklyn Dodgers were on TV before they moved to Los Angeles. And on Channel 13, you could watch Willie Mays and the New York Giants play at the Polo Grounds. And the Yankees were on WPIX, Channel 11. So there were these other stations, including number 5. But on the channel, this is what I wanted to bring up, on the channel where you could watch the Brooklyn Dodgers before they moved from Ebbets Field, it was called WOR. And that station had a lot of old movies. And if you got sick, just so you know, because there's all this stuff about our CDC, everything about vaccinations. I know it's probably a topic we don't want to talk about. I don't want to talk about it either. My dad was a doctor. We got vaccinated, like we got shots. If you had the measles or something, you got the measles. But, if you needed polio vaccine, which had just come out, that's what you got, because people were getting polio and there was an actual vaccine for it. And that was a big thing in the 50s. But back to WOR on Channel 9, they would play these movies like King Kong or something, or the original Wolfman, right, from the 1930s. And they'd play for like a week, okay, not just one day. It's almost like having your own recording of these things. And a lot of sci-fi movies were coming in, like The Day the Earth Stood Still, the original one directed by Robert Wise, 1951. That starts with a spacecraft landing on the lawn of the White House. Okay, that to me is the best science fiction movie ever, including Star Wars, Close Encounters, E.T., you know what I mean? Whatever Spielberg is coming up with, for June 12th, Disclosure Day. I mean, that might top them all, who knows? I loved Close Encounters even more than Star Wars, but of course Star Wars became 9 Star Wars, you know what I mean? 6 by Lucas and then 3 more by Disney. So I've learned not just about these movies, but using astrology to understand the charts of the people who are creating them. And when you know the birth chart of somebody, particularly if you know the time and the place, the month, day, and year, this is what I always ask for in professional astrologers. You need to know as best as possible when is a person born, what time of day. People might say, well, why do you need to know that? That gives you what's called the rising sign. You can create a whole chart, circular chart. I think later you can show the flying saucer chart, right? So that people can see what a chart is whenever you want, which we'll get into shortly. But at any rate, my skill set, shall we say, there's an example this is from my podcast era. It's called Astroscope. It's over 125 free podcasts at Great Bear Enterprises under what's called Astroscope. So one of the things I wanted to introduce was, here's a perfect example. On the website, there's a section that has charts and cover stories, all kind of images in one section. And then there's the podcasts of different lengths, from like 20 minutes to 2+ hours on different topics. This was the event by an aviator businessman named Kenneth Arnold. This is 2 weeks, folks, before Roswell, and then we could open the door to the rest of the discussion. 2 weeks before Roswell, a rather unknown, I mean, an aviator businessman was flying his plane between Mount Rainier. This is okay. This has definitely happened. Okay, so there's no ifs, ands, or buts about this. This is exactly how the term flying saucers entered our lexicon. Nobody called whatever these things were, and they exist. You know, you go back in ancient times. You go back, right? Ancient aliens, the whole thing of chariots of the gods, things that you've been reporting, Nibiru, what was happening in Mesopotamia, whatever we have been studying, about ancient cultures. Who were these people? Was it just earthlings who were amazing, like in ancient Egypt? They were just far ahead of their times, or did some beings come down, like from Orion, right, or the Pleiades, or whatever? That's sort of where we're moving with this whole movie thing. So back on what's fortunate about this event, this shows like where I'm at. And again, if you do anything with me, from getting reports, getting charts, doing consultations, what I will assure you is that you're not going to find a more down to earth, practical. I mean, I'm in a field where my own parents thought for many years our son is out of his mind. Like he could go into medicine, take over dad's practice, and have a good life. Get married, have kids, live in the big city. Be at the country club. Play golf, right? Do all these things. That wasn't, like you said. It was more like, doctor of the stars of this, of spirituality, and you couldn't have had a different turn. So back on this day, this guy Kenneth Arnold is a businessman aviator. He's flying between Mount Rainier and Mount Adams. The reason there's this chart is he records at 2:59 in the afternoon. So it's just like a lot of people, I've done thousands of chart readings for people. This is an actual drawing that he did for the Army Air Forces back in 47. This is something I do want to hopefully squeak in today before we conclude today's kind of thing. 1947 is the key year of everything that changed regarding, it was Roswell 2 weeks after this event, and so on. So we'll get into this in a moment. But in 1947, under Harry Truman, because of everything that was happening or appeared to be happening between flying saucers, between Roswell and whatever else was going on, okay, Harry Truman, or President Truman, who had just taken over, after the death of FDR in 1945, when
Yeah. And let me jump in on this real quick, okay, Mark, because it's tough. Sometimes you get going, and I want to add to what you're saying, because you're just hitting on so many key points. And I think this is really important. 1947 was also the same year of Operation High Jump, if I remember right. And that's where Admiral Byrd went to Antarctica and claimed to have found places beyond the poles. And then years later, an alleged diary came out where Admiral Byrd, I don't think this was Admiral Byrd's diary. I think somebody else wrote it, but a lot of people do believe this, where he allegedly made contact with people inner Earth. But what's so interesting is that was 1947. That was the same year as Roswell. That was also wasn't that right around World War II?
Well, the conclusion of the again, we're all over the place here, but the Roswell group were the ones who flew the mission over Hiroshima. Okay. Dropping the atomic bomb.
That was the Roswell group?
Yeah. August 6th, 45. They were the people, Enola Gay, the flight. So that came out of there. And then the next 3 days later was Nagasaki. So that also happened because Harry Truman came in. We'll get into this the other time, but Harry Truman was like the third vice president under Roosevelt, who had 4 terms. And he died just a couple months into his 4th term in April of 1945. What Harry Truman didn't know was that the Manhattan Project had been underway over there in New Mexico with thousands of people, to create an atomic bomb, because the Americans were afraid that the Nazis and what was happening in Germany, they had all this advanced science and so on. They were experimenting. And Albert Einstein, who had come over from Germany back in the 1930s, wrote a letter in August of 38 or whatever it is, because all the reports were coming in. We were already making all these discoveries about the neutron, the electron, sort of fission, which happened December 2nd of 1942 in Chicago in the United States. Einstein himself was not allowed actually to be part of that whole group because he was from Germany. And even though he was brilliant with all, space-time continuum, relativity, and everything else, they just, the American government was, look what happened with Japanese Americans being interned, during World War II, and so on, because we're afraid after Pearl Harbor, different things. I mean, it was a different time period than now, although in many ways it's not all that different. But that drawing that you're showing there, the reason that I created that chart is that so that we get a clear understanding. That's 2 weeks before Roswell was reported. And Roswell was reported in the Roswell Daily newspaper as saying, Army captures flying spacecraft or flying saucer. But you see, the term flying saucer only existed at a Kenneth Arnold sighting of 9 fast-moving discs flying between Mount Rainier and Mount Adams. So what happened was, first of all, he recorded at 2:59 in the afternoon, which was Pacific Standard Time in the state of Washington. So that way, astrologers like myself, and I've been studying this for several decades. And that chart that you showed is from my podcast that I did several years ago. 3 of them were called The Secret of Star Wars. This connects to George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and all kinds of things. But the key of all this this is 1947. So the thing is, Spielberg is born in 1946, a year before. He's a baby. In 1944, George Lucas is born. But you see, when they're growing up, they're going back to what was happening in the 40s with Germany and America and the space race, what was happening with Foo Fighters and like amazing planes and bombs and like World War this and that. And so in their imagination, they wind up conjuring the stuff up that first hits us, particularly in 1977 with Star Wars in the spring and Close Encounters in the fall. So here's what happens here. So June 24th. Now you see it says July 47. So that was a drawing that happened later. But on June 24th, on that day at 2:59, this guy is flying his plane, right? The next day, he shows up in Oregon. Okay, so he's in Washington, and he's giving a press conference. Okay, Kenneth Arnold. Who the heck was Kenneth Arnold? He was a businessman and an aviator, and he was, just a guy. He had been, born in actually a month before my dad. My dad was in the military he was born in April of 1915. This guy was born in March of 1915. So when I learned about that, I realized, wow, he was a contemporary of my father. And my father was in the armed forces in World War II. And then another person who was a Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso. Back in 1997, we did a whole story when his book came out the day after Roswell. A lot of your listeners and audience will have that book, The Day After Roswell. And that was Lieutenant Corso, who said that he had been at the Air Force Base. I'm going to slightly forget the name. I'll remember it in a little bit, in Ohio. I'm just not remembering the name. And he was part of the whole group of people.
Patterson Air Force Base.
Wright-Patterson, and the reason why he's very important in this, we'll get back to Arnold in a second. He was 80 plus years old when he wrote the Day After Roswell. Okay, he wrote that in 1997, but you see, Roswell happened in 1947, and so Lieutenant Colonel Corso was in the military under Eisenhower. Okay, Eisenhower, a real president, leader of D-Day. So you can go back in the records. This is not faked or anything else. You can see pictures of Lieutenant Colonel Corso. So for 40 years, he kept this secret, okay? Because all these people that connected to Roswell and flying saucers or whoever it was, and it's not just America, it's in Russia and Mexico and Chile, everywhere around the world. We have all of these things that have been reported. And for some reason, nobody is able to just come out, right, and say, okay, we've been visited, they're here, whatever it is, which is what we're nearing. So what happened was, in the next day after Kenneth Arnold, he came to the press in a small town in Oregon, and he was giving his talk about like what he saw, and a reporter heard what he was saying about these 9 disc-shaped objects that were flying at an incredible rate. So a reporter says to him, like, can you describe a little bit more about what you saw, right? And Kenneth Arnold says the following. This is what's so magical about how flying saucers entered our lexicon, our language. So Kenneth Arnold says, you know, if you take a stone, and who hasn't done this? Tell me you haven't done this in your life, right? Anybody listening? And you're at a lake and you skim it, right? You take a smooth stone and you throw it against the water to try and skim it, right? To make it go hop, like whatever it is. And he's describing that these discs are coming out of nowhere, right? And they're flying at like 1,200, he says, like, could have been 1,200 miles an hour. But he recorded the time as 2:59. Then the reporter says, you mean like a flying saucer? You see what I mean? Like a saucer, like for a cup and a saucer, he's thinking it's a visual thing. And Arnold says, yeah, like that. 2 days later, there's an article in somewhere in Iowa or something reporting this event and says, you know, businessman, aviator says 9 flying saucers, you know, did this. And so then when Roswell happens, the Roswell event actually happened not on July 8th, which is the day that the Daily Roswell newspaper says we captured a flying saucer, and then they denied it, you know, 24 hours later, which started the whole thing about what's true, what isn't true, who's lying, where all this is coming from. So on all the things that I've seen, Ancient Aliens, The Unexplained with William, you know, Shatner and all these other things, the crash of, you know, was it Matt Brazel's farm took place in June. You see what I mean? Around somewhere before July 8th. Okay. And then, but they didn't discover the material. So they had to go out, you know, the army, whoever was at Roswell, you know, that area, they eventually heard that some debris came from some kind of exploded thing. And that's what created the whole thing later on. Now we could just open the door. Oh, it was a weather balloon, you know, like 24 hours later. And they have that picture, you know what I mean, of the guys on the cover. And it looks like, you know, he's like deer in the headlights, right? Okay, weather balloon, whatever. And he's showing this, you know, these things because there were weather balloons. And they tried to say, no, it wasn't we didn't retrieve any bodies. You know, that's a myth. So they had to, you know, get all these bigwigs out. Anyway, this picture came in July where he was asked, Kenneth Arnold was asked, because he made news, national news, if not international news, saying, hey, I saw flying saucers, when he actually saw these flying discs that a reporter and he, in the conversation, it became, oh, you mean like a flying saucer. So before that time, we had unidentified flying objects going back, you know, Jefferson, before he was president, was said to have seen them. And you go back to hundreds all over the planet, you know what I mean? And it's not just, you know, Chariots of the Gods and all that, although there were so many of those books by Eric von Daniken. And even, you know, like the creator of Twilight Zone, Rod Serling, I remember in the 70s, and he was getting very ill. Rod Serling was an interesting person. He was born, he lived a Chiron cycle, which is, we all have a Chiron cycle. If we live to be 50 years old, 49, 51, Chiron comes back. That's the cycle of Chiron. Just like other planets, like the sun has a 1-year cycle, the moon has a 27-day cycle, Saturn has a 30-year cycle, and so on. So in astrology, we're dealing with cycles. Well, now we're back to this whole thing because this is almost 80 years. It's going to be 79 years since flying saucers. So literally in June, when Disclosure Day comes out on the weekend of Friday, Saturday, Sunday, June 12th to the 14th, which includes Flag Day, and the president's birthday is Flag Day, where he turns 80. And then the next month, we're going to have the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in early July, in July 4th, which is itself a challenging day, where Mars and Uranus are going to be together in the sky. And you know, you just showed, okay, these are some pictures. This is just a picture that'll be a poster you'll be seeing more of. It says at the top, we deserve to know. The one thing, if you start watching this trailer, which you can find on what's called the International Movie Database, IMDb, you know, you can just get there for free. They'll show you coming attractions, or, you know, what's in your local movie theater or what's coming ahead. There's something to do with the human eye. That's all any of us know, that has to do with whatever Spielberg is imagining. Okay. And let's remember, okay, so one of the things I wanted people to know is he's a Sagittarian, born in 1946, Steven Spielberg. He's born on December 18 of 1946. And anyone who's born around the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th of December has their sun at what we call the galactic center. Okay, in astrology and astronomy, both, we know that our Earth is revolving around, we have a 26,000 year cycle where our solar system and the Earth are orbiting what we now know to be a black hole, or whatever it is at the center of our galaxy, the Milky Way. We didn't know we were even in a galaxy until 1938. You know, we just saw a bunch of stars out there, and it's just been amazing, you know, in the last like 90 years of what the James Webb telescope can tell us, and these other telescopes, you know, about the universe. So, but the reason I bring up Steven Spielberg's birthday is he did give us Close Encounters in 77. He then gave us E.T. in 1983. He also did a comedy, I don't know if you ever saw this, with John Belushi and others, about 1941. About, this is where we get the idea of Foo Fighters. There's even a group called musical group, where there were these events after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Actually, it was in early 42 that this happened off the west coast of the United States. And so Spielberg did a movie about this that was more of a comedy, because there were all of these news reports on the West Coast about seeing strange, you know, lights and shootings, you know, by our radar and different facilities. And that's where the term Foo Fighters came from. Okay, these kind of, what are they? You know what I mean? Are they real planes? Are they spacecraft? Whatever it is. So Spielberg even did a comedy on that. And then what was the other one? Okay, then he did War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells. Okay, remember that? Tom Cruise. Okay, that movie. So he did that one, and now he's doing this one, Disclosure Day. So he's born with the sun at the galactic center, which is the center of the greater solar system, or where our solar system and the Earth is revolving around in a 200 plus million year cycle. We're 26,000 light years away from the center of our home in the galaxy. Now, I bring this up because Arthur C. Clarke, okay, is also one of these persons. He's born in 1917. I think it's December 16th. His sun is also at the galactic center. And what did Arthur C. Clarke do? He did 2001: A Space Odyssey. Okay. Did you ever see it? Rex? It's a 1967, 68 movie. You know what I mean?
I haven't seen it. I need to watch it because I know it's a famous movie. Yeah, it's a
famous movie. You brought it up about the slabs that just keep appearing. Remember, you said
yeah,
the monolith. That's where the monoliths come from. That movie was Arthur C. Clarke's novel. Okay, and he's also is a Sagittarian sun. So you Sagittarian sun men and women out there, this is the sign of long range thinking, long term goals, like the big picture. It's ruled by your sun sign is ruled by the planet Jupiter, and you don't have to just be born with the sun at December 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. But the thing is, if you have Sagittarius rising, if your moon, like I have the moon in Sagittarius and a bunch of other planets, you could have Venus in Sagittarius, Mars in Sagittarius, Sagittarius rising. But the way we get to understand someone of the profound level of an Arthur C. Clarke, whose ideas became 2001: A Space Odyssey, and he also did a phenomenal book that became a TV series called Childhood's End. It's a 1953.
I saw the series.
Okay, I read the book, and you might remember in the book, I don't know if they changed it for TV, this all happened at the UN. Now look what's happening at the UN now, because we have a new whole thing about what's going on in the Middle East. And it's a whole conflagration. Nobody knows where it's going, why, how intense, and so on. This is what I call, and I'm just putting in quotes, Persian Gulf War III, because we had the first one under the first Bush, which was a UN mission. That's why Saddam Hussein survived that. He had taken Kuwait. We said, George Bush said, it will not stand. We went on a UN mission. We had all those people like Powell and everybody else fighting, and that was over. And then we had another one because of 9/11. And under the second George Bush, because, he said, well, that Saddam tried to kill my father. So suddenly we're at war with Iraq, you know what I mean? Which were not the perpetrators, according to at least the facts as we know them from what happened, back in 9/11. And now we're having another one because, yes, over there in the Middle East, we have all kinds of questions about nuclear power and who should have it and who shouldn't have it. But without judging America or anywhere else, we're the only country that's ever done anything regarding dropping a weapon or exploding a weapon. We're all afraid of the fact that Russia has this, China has this, Pakistan has this, India has it, France, the United Kingdom. Israel has it, but they won't admit that they have it, nuclear weapons. And so all of the stuff about whatever's going on here. So we're in a whole planetary conflagration. One more point, and then let's please bring all this up. So getting back to my childhood stuff, I got to watch all these movies, like the original The Day the Earth Stood Still, which was just a phenomenal movie directed by Robert Wise. And I find this astounding because he's the same director who did The Sound of Music, where he won the Academy Award for being Best Director. He also was a co-Best Director with West Side Story in like 1961. So the same guy who's directing Julie Andrews, right? And all those kids, right? When one of the great family movies of all time, 1965 movie, The Sound of Music, right? And West Side Story with Natalie Wood and all the stuff in 1961. Also did, to me, the greatest science fiction movie ever. Patricia Neal, Michael Rennie, the little kid who's on the show, who's on the movie, the first The Day the Earth Stood Still, becomes Bud in Father Knows Best. See, again, what a lot of you newbies who were born in the 70s, 80s, 90s don't know is like what we older generation, I say older generation, I was a kid, to me, the older generation was my dad and my mom and their parents, and we're talking about like 1880s, 1890s, the older generation is born. They're the ones who have to deal with World War I and then World War II and survive all that. The lucky ones, so that I'm here because my dad happened to survive that, otherwise I'm not here. So we all got to watch these movies. And what I'm saying is I like Netflix. Okay. When I actually don't like it, but it's more of like what's available than what's on television, shall we say, right? We all have these places, YouTube, Netflix and other places where you can see a lot of these movies. What I'm telling all of you is that myself as an astrologer, look, I'm an older person, so I'm giving away my main secret here, is that the reason I watch something now, whether it's science fiction or anything, a family, a comedy, could be anything, is who's in it and what's their birthday. So I look that up. If I'm lucky enough, sometimes we have the birth times of these people, but even if you just know the day or the month, day, and year, we have all these books called ephemerides. Here's one that I'll just show everybody. I did this before the last time, I think, but this is, it's going to look a little weird. Anyway, it's going to look backward here, probably. New American Ephemeris. This is a 10-year or 11-year one, but all these pages, every day of the year has the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, every planet, how fast they're moving, what signs they're going through, whether they're going forward or appear to be going retrograde, and a whole bunch of other things. So this is kind of my Bible. This is my scientific source, for what I create, this cosmic calendar, which is on a new website called iconicastrology.com, but I've been doing it for almost 45 years, like what's happening in the sky. People can subscribe to that. You can see it on Great Bear. So at any rate, my secret is basically the secret work. It's not really secret, is I watch movies. I've been watching them for years, or even TV shows. And the reason I find a liking to many of them, like for instance, just to give you an example, there's the Chicago series, on what is it, Peacock, NBC, but it used NBC. And they do Chicago Fire, Chicago Med, Chicago PD. Well, many years ago, I watched an episode of Chicago PD, and the two main stars were born within one day of my birthday. Of course, different years, but it was like, oh, it'll be interesting. I'm a sun sign Pisces. Let's see how I can understand their methodology. What are their ways of looking at life? So that's what I do, because I have studied astrology and I can find the birthdays of these people. Sometimes their numerology becomes significant. And guess what, folks? Even on Netflix now, they have a section where they're actually organizing some of the material. Maybe some of you have seen this. Like we just recently had the sun in Aquarius. Okay, so it was like Aquarius section. There was another thing about Mercury retrograde, which is a whole thing. I've done 3 podcasts, because no planets in our solar system ever are really going retrograde, because we're in a heliocentric solar system, not in a geocentric one, even though our charts are based on the Earth. A lot of you will see, oh, don't do this, don't do that, because Mercury's retrograde. But every planet appears to go retrograde in the course of the year, but they're not really going in reverse, because nothing goes in reverse. It's an illusion, okay? So we don't want to create fear and worry in astrology that planets are doing this backwards kind of thing when they're not actually doing it. Okay, so that's a little pet subject of mine. I'm not saying that so-called reversals of planets that appear to be happening should just be ignored, but they're not actually going backwards. So we need to understand the truth and reality that we live in a heliocentric solar system. We've known that since Copernicus and Galileo back 400 to almost 500 years ago. You know what I mean? And we need to recognize that.
Right on. Right on. That's cool. Yeah, you know your stuff, man. You've brought that up before, and I find it fascinating how much people will organize their daily routine based upon Mercury retrograde. It's kind of fun.
In fact, this was really weird, because it's become have you ever had anybody on your show talking about like creating what is called the thought form?
Oh yeah. Yes, okay. Absolutely.
So, like etheric, like, astral projection, these kind of things.
Sure.
So one of the things that we'll have to talk about this another time. There's a whole sphere of what's called esoteric astrology, which I've done a lot of studies. It has a lot to do with the Middle East. Okay. So this whole thing, we've talked about this before a couple of years ago. We're in what's called the Piscean age, which refers to what we call the zodiac. And it really is based on the constellations, what's called precession of the equinox, the beginning of spring, which we just had on March 20th. We just had the beginning of spring in the Northern Hemisphere. But guess what, folks? When we start spring, the Southern Hemisphere starts fall. And this is another whole area that my main teacher, Dane Rudjar, who is a fantastic astrologer, brought up a lot of things that a lot of the astrologers that I see online, bless their souls, a lot of them are professionals, they're great and so on, but there's now a lot of selling and promoting of things. I've seen on Facebook a lot of very erroneous things from astronomy places and astrology places, where they'll put a picture, like I've seen this thing like moon joins with Saturn, and they show a giant picture of Saturn with all the rings, right? As if it's like literally closer to us than the moon, which is 250,000 miles. And what'll happen is, if you don't know astronomy, you'll be thinking, oh my God, is Saturn really that close? You know what I mean? Because if you don't know astronomy, right? If you haven't studied it, and you just suddenly see these pictures, and you'll see these things, and it's basically to get attention, you know what I mean, through a visual, okay? Now, we all have to promote what we're doing. need to promote what I'm doing to do as best as I can. You're promoting what you're doing. You know, so the thing is that back to TV, you know, back to that. The thing I want to bring up so that all of you don't think I'm an old fuddy-duddy, so to speak. The difference between everything that I'm now on your show, right? YouTube, Leak Project, Patreon, and all these different places, including more in the future, is that they're all out there, right? They're all out there. Whereas TV, all those TV sets that we bought, right, were inside our houses or our homes or our apartments or wherever they were. You know, you could go to a laundromat, right? And still now, right, at a lot of bars and other places, sports bar, you're constant. You still got those TVs going, right? But they're mostly sports, right? And now we even have sports betting, this and that. You can't even get your, you know, what do you call it, ESPN without some kind of ESPN station about the odds of this and that, and every single sport where people are betting left and right. Who's going to win? Which pitcher is going to pitch shutout? How many runs are going to be scored? You know, who's going to win the basketball game, March Madness, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got this whole kind of labyrinth or this extended world. Whereas when I was growing up, in your own home, your apartment, your room, wherever it was, you turned on the television, you know what I mean? And it was inside. It's almost like the difference between like having a dream versus what's called astral projection, right? Or something like that, where you're out, you know, apparently, and I have written dreams down when I was in my 20s. So I did explore dreams, out of the body experiences, a lot of those things, and did have several of those, you know, one in particular in OBE that changed my life. But I also kept a dream notebook and studied all of this, particularly from Edgar Cayce, America's Sleeping Prophet, and all of this stuff. But what I'm trying to explain is that when you're watching TV, okay, in your home or in your room or in your hotel room or at the airport or wherever you're watching it, okay, is a kind of internal thing. Okay, it's like your imagination. Okay, whereas this other world that we're now participating in, that you are doing for your audience, you know, which is a phenomenal kind of thing, is in sort of like the same place where the cloud is, right? I hated when they came up with the term, whoever did it, Microsoft, Bill Gates, you know, whoever it was originally, between him and Google and Apple, whatever it is, suddenly we had the thing called, I remember whenever it came out, I was talking to my friend who was a day trader, and I said, they couldn't come up with something other than the cloud? Because to me, clouds are cloudy. You know what I mean? They're unclear. You know what I mean? Most clouds are. There are cirrus clouds. If you study clouds, there's, you know, cumulonimbus, there are threatening clouds, and then there are nice, you know, fluffy, wispy clouds. But it never gave me a sense of you know, to like, this is a done deal. That, you know, when they say it's safe, it's in the cloud. Do you feel safe, Rex, when you hear somebody say it's in the cloud?
I mean, it depends on not particularly, no.
Look at your background. I don't see a whole bunch of clouds back there. I'm just saying, I'm just joking. I have a good sense of humor. But the thing is, I'm just being honest. I mean, how many people, if you actually told them and said, when you think of like everything is saved that you have in the cloud, are you feeling 100% confident that it's there?
Not particularly.
I would just say, you know, if it was like on Seinfeld, you see, and that was a joke, it's in the vault when they would be on TV, George and Jerry, it's in the vault. Just tell me. I'm not going to say anything to anybody. It's in the vault. You can be, oh, it's definitely in the vault. And of course, they would spill the beans on somebody. So it's, you know, but if they had said, look, we know that we wanted to name it the cloud, but we were watching Seinfeld. We thought the super vault, like Earth's vault, could have been the thing. Then I'm feeling a little bit better. It's locked away in a, you know, time capsule combination thing. Nobody can get to it except for you when you need it.
So speaking of the cloud, good
Right.
timing, because we're going into the age of Aquarius. I don't know when we're going to get there, but it's like that's the next shift in the
Right.
zodiac. And the vault does sound much better, but it seems like everything's going to the air. It's instant. You have so many options, so many things to choose from.
This is where this comes from. Okay, in astrology, there is called, it's major cycles of Jupiter and Saturn. We've known about this from, you know, all the stuff about that you've done about Enki and Mesopotamia and the Sumerians, right? There may be a planet, you know, that has a 3,600-year cycle. All those books by that, you know, great teacher, you know who I'm talking about.
Well, I've only read one book of Sitchin, but a lot of the stuff
the
on
12th
the ancient
planet, right?
I was just going to say a lot of the stuff on the ancient Sumerian tablets that I've read were actually from the Oxford website, where they took the tablets and they translated them directly into English. So I think Sitchin made a lot of stuff up, but he has some good theories. But I don't see
the proof is usually in the pudding. Look, it's the same thing with the guy who said, and this is pretty much a true story, Schliemann, the German, who said, you know, I found Troy, you know what I mean? And he found it in Turkey, you know what I mean? But because the thing is that a lot of these things, it's like people from 2,000 years ago or whenever it was would say, this is where this thing was. Just like where we get Atlantis and a lot of these shows like The Unexplained, Ancient Aliens, they've done so many things on it, you know, Bermuda Triangle, things, you know, you've had guests on about like, what was Atlantis? The best person on Atlantis to me is Edgar Cayce. There's a little book called Edgar Cayce on Atlantis. It's 100 pages, that's it. But between that and two other main teachers, Rudolf Steiner, who was a seer out of Austria, who created a whole field. What we have is the Waldorf educational system and different things in biodynamic art, gardening and agriculture. But we also have what's called his variation of theosophy called anthroposophical society and so on. So the first esoteric book I ever read was called Knowledge of the Higher Worlds and How to Attain It by this guy, Rudolf Steiner. And he was a genius and so on. And then I also, before going to the Findhorn Community Educational Center in Scotland, I worked at a place called Lucis Trust, Lucis Publishing, where they were kind of an offshoot of what's called the Theosophical Society that was formed in 1875. And so there
Blavatsky, right?
Blavatsky. Well,
Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society?
Helena Blavatsky was the channel for a so-called a person who's called the Master DK from India or Tibet and so on. One of someone who's, let's say, he's an enlightened human being. Okay, if we think of Buddha, Jesus, Pythagoras, these different people, Plato, there's just so many of these different souls that came in, whether in Egypt and India, different places, Palestine, whatever it may be, over the centuries, who were said to be a teacher, a messiah, Zoroaster. There's all these different people when you study these, and what were called the great initiates, of different times. So at any rate, for 30 years, Helena Blavatsky was the channel for this particular person who's known as DK. Okay, he has an actual name. And then after that, in New York, there was a woman named Alice A. Bailey, and she took on the same channeling role. And I worked there next to the United Nations for 2 years after going to certain full moon meetings and doing the thing like, again, you said in the beginning, like instead of becoming a doctor of the body, a GP like my dad and my uncle, I became a doctor of the psyche, of the stars, of astrology, numerology, this whole other field. And I don't have a PhD. I do have actually, my degree is in social science at Michigan State University, but it's the perfect degree. For many decades, I was thinking, because I graduated in 1971, why did I do social science, which was then sort of like psychology was when Freud and Jung were beginning in the 1800s. Sociology 50 years ago was just sort of getting into what is going on in society, different groups, socio-politics, different kind of things. People were taking courses in political science and sociology and psychology. But now it's become really, really strong. So everything I learned in sociology now serves me really well. I had great teachers and I really got into it, and I did very well in that. And it's just sort of trying to understand our society in America and societies all around the world. And now we really need to, this is part of the problem that we actually do have in this country. I mean, we've been having it for decades. You know, who are we? 250 years since the Declaration of Independence. And that wasn't the beginning really of all the different groups that came here. You know, Columbus, you know, people, we have a bridge called the Verazon. No, actually, you know, you got to be careful what you tell me, because when I was 10 in New York City at public school, let's see, I was actually 12 years old. Our teacher gave us an assignment, and we had to go to the local library and find a Viking explorer that wasn't Leif Erikson, somebody else who we could find who was actually traveling and landed in Newfoundland or Canada or the East Coast of the United States. And it was kind of funny that you bring this up, because I found somebody named, I hope I'm remembering, Bjarni Herjolfsson. At any rate, this was kind of like a Leif Erikson character. And again, hundreds of years before 1492 and Columbus coming to, you know, supposedly discovering the New World by accident. There were those Viking explorers, so you're right on. And we do know, you know, there have been all these places, right, through archaeology. There's that island, I mean, Oak Island, what is it? Like, have you had people, you know, where they're trying to figure out what happened on this island, like off the, you know, Nova Scotia and all these kind of things, that maybe there's treasures that are buried, right, with gold, Viking things, you know what I mean? Things like that connect up back to the Knights Templar and all this other stuff, those movies that were created, you know what I mean, with Nicolas Cage, remember National Treasure 1 and 2 and all that stuff.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, so whatever these stories are, we have gotten, you know, and again, this is the, like, I'll study the chart of Nicolas Cage because he's been in a lot of these movies, you know what I mean? So whenever I see another Nicolas Cage movie, whether it's good or bad, you know what I mean, I understand, like, why he's been selected. Well, why does he keep getting into these movies? You know what I mean? Or other people, you know what I mean? Why did they play these roles? So, like, Emily Blunt is apparently the female star of Disclosure Day. Now, I haven't studied her chart yet, but I will study it. And back to, you know, because I know we only have a few more minutes and stuff. Yeah, but by the way, that chart, okay, all those things. The chart, the circle chart, okay, so that's literally in my podcast number 27. If you go to Astroscope on Great Bear Enterprises, The Secret of Star Wars starts at podcast 26, and there's the chart of George Lucas, and in 27 is this one, The Moment of Flying Saucers. And this is the chart which I connect up to the United States birth chart from July 4th, 1776. This chart connected to our current president. If we do wind up, you know, look, we've never come closer than now, regardless of what anybody thinks of our president or any president, okay, for that matter. Putting every political thing out of your mind is like, Nixon saw something. Reagan saw, there's a whole episode on this on The Unexplained or an Ancient Aliens, a whole thing that Nixon supposedly took Jackie Gleason, his friend, to some place. Did that really happen in Florida? Because the comedian Jackie Gleason literally had a house with his wife where it looked like a UFO and stuff. So there's all these reports that say, I mean, I'm just putting this out now. What I'm saying here is not a fact. It's what has been reported as a fact, okay, on Ancient Aliens, definitely on several of their shows and so on, where there's a whole thing about presidents, you know, like Jimmy Carter saw a UFO. So he reported it. This is before he was a president, you know what I mean? He was in the Navy. He was running nuclear submarines, you know what I mean? I mean, these people reported serious things. Reagan on a plane saw something out of the window of his plane and reported that. He wasn't president. I don't know if he was president at the time or not. I don't think he was. I think he was governor. And, you know, the whole thing that has maybe been, I mean, what happened in Arizona, I think you said to me another time that didn't happen. But the point is that the governor.
Oh, it happened. Are you talking about the Phoenix Lights?
Yeah.
Oh, they definitely happened. There's actually some There's a strong possibility it was like a psyop, a big
yeah.
operation.
Well, and then we talked the last time about like here's the thing with it could very well be what happened in New Jersey a year ago, and then like the governor of New Jersey, and then people are saying, well, come on, why again, every one of these things, the TikTok things from 2002, the New York Times reporting, in its newspaper. I mean, you can't get any closer to the fact that as our current president always says, the failing New York Times. The failing New York Times, which has been in existence since 1851, you know what I mean? And I've done the chart for that. If that's failing, that's 175 years of failing, Mr. President. I know our president often jokes around and wants to disparage, this group or that. But if they're the ones, if what you're doing to release stuff about Area 51, if you're serious about this, if there is all the stuff that, our government and all the other governments on Earth have been hiding, then the thing is, you're going to have to give the New York Times a little bit of credit, because they're the ones who in December of 17, revealed the whole thing about the TikToks, the Navy, all of these things with videos, right? Well, why was that? Why did that happen? Why is it so hard for our Congress, who've been working on disclosure? And then you have the Canadian former defense minister who's been at a lot of these conferences saying, I was defense minister in Canada. I've seen these things. It's real, and so on. We have all of this evidence. So one final thing that I want to say. So back to 1947. So where I'd like to go with this, if I'm allowed, is the original stuff, because a lot of these researchers, Stanton Friedman is a good example, who was into nuclear technology. He's passed on. The original group of the people who were involved with what was called Majestic 12, the beginning of this group of people that happened in 1947. So what we had in 1947, because these are facts, folks, is that suddenly we had the National Security Act by Harry Truman that took place at the end of July of 1947, the very month of Roswell, and 1 month after flying saucers. Okay, so you got flying saucers, you got Roswell. You have a newspaper, the Daily Roswell thing, saying we captured a flying saucer. You get the cat out of that bag. What are you going to do? Like, if that's not true, right? Then, like, okay, we tried to get rid of it. We have all these generals, like, whatever, we're putting a lid on it. So why do you then have to create the National Security Act, which then creates the Defense Department? We weren't the Defense Department. You know how now the president is trying to make it the Department of War? That's what it was. From George Washington, we had a Secretary of War, because that was the beginning of the United States. We had defeated the British, and now we're a young country, and it's 1789, and there's a Treasury. Hamilton is in there, Treasury, and you have a Secretary of War, and there was some other person, whoever it was. The person who was like the Attorney General, although I think it was Attorney General, but they didn't actually have a Justice Department. Like 3 people or 4 people in Washington, you know what I mean, running the government, right? So the thing was, we had a War Department until the summer. Actually, it was September after July 31, 47. That was passed, or whatever, July 26th, I think it was. So Congress passes this bill that creates the Defense Department. We're now going to be not the War Department, Defense. And on September 18 of 1947, the CIA is born as part of this whole thing, the Central Intelligence Agency. This is not fake news. You can go to their website. They promote their own birthday. It's there. But for an astrologer, this is important. Okay, so we may not know the CIA. Do we know the time? Well, 9 o'clock in the morning, whatever it was, September 18. That's an approximation. But you can find out all this stuff. So the other point where I want to go here is there was a whole thing of supposedly a group of 12 people who were part of something that was called, and there's tons of books on this, written by these people who are now passed on. A lot of these people are gone. So, Disclosure movie, the Disclosure movement, all of these things are sort of carried on the backs of these other people from the original group that was called Magic 12 or the Majestic 12. And a lot of this information of who was on there are documents, through the free information kind of thing. They've found these different things. That's how we learned that Area 51 definitely exists. What was it, 2013? Somebody contacted the free information thing in the United States, and our government said, yeah, it exists. And ever since then, which is what, 13 years ago, all these people are floating around like Area 51, 52, 53. What the heck is going on there? If we denied that it existed, why did we do that? And it could be like, oh, it's top secret. You know what I mean? That makes some sense. We don't know. We don't want other people knowing that, just like we didn't want to know other people knowing in the Manhattan Project. So a lot of that can be explained as like, does it mean that there are UFOs? Does it mean that we've reversed engineering? However, the other side of the coin, Lieutenant Colonel Corso, coming out at age 82 when he's about to die, saying, I, was part of this thing. I worked with President Eisenhower. Here's me in the military, where you can check his records. Yes, he worked with Eisenhower. So when you accumulate all of this stuff, anyway, like to go back into some of that possibly, and who was doing that research, because what's going to happen when Disclosure Day comes out June 12th and that weekend, the astrology of that weekend, by the way, one other thing I want to say is that 2 days after that movie comes out on the weekend of June 12th, when you got millions of people seeing that movie, the calls for disclosure, which will literally be 3 weeks before the, Declaration of Independence 250th anniversary. It's also going to be, and I'm not saying I know this, from an inside standpoint, but the President of the United States is born on Flag Day. We don't celebrate Flag Day, but like this president has a lot of flags, when he's doing anything, and he's done a lot of stuff over 2 terms. You know what I mean? Wherever he goes, there's lots of American flags flying. So the thing is, I'm not saying originally Disclosure Day was supposed to come out in May, from what I have seen, and they changed it to June 12th. You know what I mean? And it is on a Friday, which is the time you want to do this thing. It's a major Spielberg movie. And I think what it's going to do is it's going to prevent a lot of other movies from coming out, because other movies, they might want to come out and say, well, a lot of people are going to be going to the movie theater. You know what I mean? So if they have a top movie, then they might come out. But the odds of like doing some kind of really small art-like movie and have it come out like on the weekend, you see, of Disclosure Day, it's going to limit the competition. You know what I mean? Everybody's going to want to see this and maybe see it again. You see what I mean? And maybe 1 or 2 other firms will be courageous enough to say, people are going to be going to the theater. You know what I mean? So if they get their fill of, Spielberg on the 12th and the 13th, maybe on the 14th, 15th, and the 16th, they'll see us. You see what I mean? So it's hard to know what's going to happen, but it's going to be, here's my little thing to tell everybody. There's a new moon on Sunday, June 14th, which is the president's birthday. And that new moon is at 25 degrees of Gemini, which is the degree where the planet Uranus was discovered on March 13 of 1781, the discovery of the first planet beyond Saturn that changed everything about our solar system, made us understand that there's a planet beyond Saturn, which we thought for thousands of years that was the outermost planet. There's nothing beyond Saturn. That's the end, end of the solar system. And the discovery of Uranus in 1781 in March led to America's victory over the British in October of that year. And America is very connected to the planet Uranus. And our president has Sun conjunct Uranus. Uranus is the planet of shockwaves, surprises. This is why every other day, you're reading a report. Here's what we're doing in, the Middle East. Oh, wait a minute. We're not doing it. We're doing this, we're doing that. This kind of thing, which was the opposite of our previous president, where everything was like, when will he say something? He's disappeared. And other presidents who have been like behind the scenes, this is a person who's out there all the time, like it or not, saying, here's what we're doing, here's what we're talking about, here's where we're going. Oh, wait a minute, we're going in another direction. Get used to it. So we're going to have a phenomenal weekend of June 12, 13, 14, and the moon is going to be contacting Jupiter, Saturn, Chiron, Uranus, and Neptune all over that time period of like even the June 11th to the 14th. So the cosmos is sort of opening this door while Spielberg's movie comes out. The president has his birthday. It's Flag Day, and we're getting ready for whatever the 250th anniversary. So that's dropping my personal microphone at this point. If you want to ask me anything else, but I know we need, we've done pretty much an hour and a few minutes, so I know we have to keep this under wraps.
Well, this, first of all, excellent information. I'm just going to add something as a nightcap to this awesome podcast. Before I do that, though, folks, do yourselves a favor. If you've considered getting a reading before, take advantage of this opportunity. Mark is one of the best on the planet when it comes to readings. He's very thorough and he's very open-minded, but not so open-minded that his brain falls out on the sidewalk. Like, you know what I mean? You got to have an open mind for it to work, but don't let it be too open. It's got to be like a parachute. If it's not open, it doesn't work. And this is what I wanted to say to finish up this awesome podcast. So check this out. I'll do a screen share here also, because I think that it'd be kind of cool to add a little bit of a visual here. And to get a reading, just go to greatbearenterprises.com and book your reading through the website. I had somebody actually send me an email a little while ago that said, Rex, Mark did an amazing job. He was so kind and so patient, and they were super happy with the reading that you did, and rightfully so. I mean, duh. I mean, I don't need to say that, but I just thought it was cool that I got an email just a little while ago after we did a show. Somebody did a reading.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, brother. So check this out. This is wild, but it makes sense. A lot of people probably heard this because this is a few days old, but if you haven't heard this, aliens.gov was registered by the government. Alien.gov. Now think about that for a minute. So the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, part of the Department of Homeland Security, registered the alien.gov and aliens.gov domains March 17th, 2026. These registrations followed a directive from President Trump to release files related to UFOs, UAPs, and extraterrestrials. So March 17th was when that happened. And this is sad. This is very sad, but I think that there might be a connection here. And I was one of the first people to report on this, actually. Air Force Major General William Neal McCasland. He vanished February 27th, and he vanished shortly. Now, this is what's interesting. Before he disappeared, a repairman showed up at his house like an hour before he disappeared. So I envision this repairman as some secret agent, and he either disappeared, this Air Force Major General, or there was some phone call, or he warned him like, dude, you know that project you were working on back in the day with Monica? Well, you need to get out of Dodge because they're coming. Somebody's coming, the cleanup crew. So get out of Dodge. So he disappears under very mysterious circumstances. He doesn't take his phone. He doesn't take his smart devices, which makes sense because if you take your phone anywhere you go, they can track you with your phone. If you have a smart watch or any smart gadgets, they can track you with your smart gadgets. So he leaves those there, but he grabs his wallet and a backpack.
So we don't know what happened to him still, right?
No. And so check this out, Mark. You know, I live in Pagosa Springs, right?
What? Okay. Yeah.
I live in Pagosa Springs, Southern Colorado. It's a small town, less than 2,000 people. Right. Well, guess who else has a second home out here in Pagosa Springs?
Who?
Air Force Major General William Neal McCasland.
Oh my God.
So they went. So anyway, then I guess he was just. Here's my theory. He took off from his house. Somebody warned him. He went to his other house in Pagosa Springs, grabbed his money, passport, survival gear, whatever, and either took off into the woods or he found somebody to pick him up and take a secret flight out of the country. That's my theory, but I've seen a lot of spy films and TV shows. So
now he's connected to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is where Lieutenant Colonel Corso said that that's where the bodies that happened with Roswell were taken. And he was put in charge by Nathan Twining or whoever it was. All this was happening basically under Eisenhower. Well, I say under Eisenhower, but it was also Truman and Eisenhower, okay? Because Eisenhower wasn't president until 1953. But he was the superior commander, you see, too.
I interviewed his great-granddaughter, Laura. Yeah. She's a great gal, Laura Eisenhower. I interviewed her. She's really nice. Sorry to interrupt. What were you saying?
No. The other thing I just wanted to say, and thank you very much for sharing all this, is that and you've been very kind. A lot of people, like, I do not charge a whole lot for, there's 3 different kinds of readings that I do. One is an hour, one is 30 minutes. The other one is it's called the Cosmic Night Owl, which is more of a short one. If people are in, like, it's more of a 20-minute consultation. So there are different prices. One is in 200, the other is 200 plus, 100 plus, and then $99. If I were living in a major city the last 40 plus years, like San Francisco, New York, I'd be charging so much more. But I wound up living in Oregon, in Eugene, for a long time, and being on the West Coast and smaller places. The other thing I want to say is, and you showed the website, again, the podcasts are all complimentary. Secret of Star Wars, all these other ones, there's over 100 of them. Every one of them is free. But we have 20 astrology reports in plain English that are they're 40% off. So if you want a report that is, it's computerized, but it's all based on your exact birth data that you send to us, that's a good way of getting into your cycles. You know, one's called The Sky Within, another one's called Skylog. We have a great numerology report based on your full name of birth. This is one way, if you don't want to spend $100+ or whatever it is, even though I will say that whoever contacts me, you're going to find a very solid experience. You get complimentary charts. Often you'll get a complimentary report as well with the reading, but not everybody's got $215 or $125 or $99. And I keep everything really low because there's so many people who are hurting out there. You know what I mean? So, but there are, it's a section called Astrology Reports, or New Astrology Reports. And everything is sort of in the astrology shop back at Great Bear Enterprises.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool.
I have classes to learn, 36 classes, and we have a new website for my cosmic calendar, which I've been doing for almost 45 years, called the Cosmic Calendar, but the website is called iconicastrology.com. I'm just throwing that out just as you're sharing about this. This is going to be very intriguing to see what happens here with this person, because seeing right pattern, you know, this information here, and knowing we older people who remember Lieutenant Colonel Corso putting his book out there the day after Roswell, and this whole association with Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So this just can't be, you know, just like an accidental thing. This is what I call synchronicity.
Right on. And I was just going to add a couple things before we finished up. Also, this gal that worked with him, Monica Reza, she went missing last year, and she was working on a project with him, and she was hiking with friends in a national forest in California. They were all hiking together, and then she literally disappeared as they were hiking together. So the story says it kind of sounds like a 411 case. And I also was going to add, folks, just to finish up, President Trump did announce February 20th that he was going to direct the Pentagon to release these files on UFOs and UAPs. And if you look at the timeline of that, the Air Force general went missing just a few days after. And the registration for aliens.gov just happened. And one other thing I was going to bring up is just the day after, the Black Vault website is a website with approximately 3.8 million files on UFOs and UAPs, as well as alien and government reports. These are Freedom of Information Act requests. And his entire server deleted on mysterious circumstances just one day after President Trump declared the release of these files. But luckily he did manage to get he had a backup on the server. So thank you so much, Mark. And you wanted to say just one other thing here and finish up?
February 20th of this year was the day that Saturn and Neptune came together, which is a big deal in astrology because they came together for the first time in 6,000 years at the beginning of the zodiac in Aries, which is what we call the birth of the zodiac, March 20th. But the event happened, Saturn, Neptune. They only come together every 36 years, and the last time was in 1989, 3 times. The Berlin Wall fell. Germany began reunification. It was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union turning into Russia. That was 1989. And so now I didn't know that the president on that day, February 20th, sort of got the ball rolling on this, and it was a very prominent astrological day. So what you just reported about all these, Monica, this guy, Wright-Patterson, the release of this stuff, and now Spielberg with the movie. You know what I mean?
It's,
So
you know what?
thank
I
you
think
so
this
much
is,
for having me on, and
yeah,
hopefully we'll
thank
continue
you.
with this, next month or whenever we need to do it.
Sounds good, man. Sounds good. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being here with us. I hope you all have a beautiful day and be excellent to each other and be the change you want to see. And remember, we come in peace.